Hello, I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Welcome to another edition of the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. It is time for hot plays, fades, and sleepers for Week 7 of the fantasy football season. I am thrilled to be joined by my son again, Henry Paur. Thanks so much for coming on the show as always.
Yeah, no problem. I always enjoy it.
Should be a lot of fun today, Henry. Just two teams on a bye this week, the Bears and Cowboys. Cowboys needing to regroup.
Yeah.
They're in a bit of a tailspin at this point. Bit of a mess, but maybe the week off will do them some good. What do you think?
Hopefully it does. Need Dak and C to get going.
Yeah, they're a mess right now, but a lot of good games this week. I'm excited about them. Some good matchups, some good fantasy matchups as well. So we're going to talk about our hot plays. We're going to give you a QB, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. Then we're going to give you three fades and a couple sleepers as well. So let's jump into it, Henry. Let's talk about our hot plays first. So we're going to do each position. We're going to start with QB. Who's your QB hot play?
I have Trevor Lawrence. He faces New England this week in a game where I figure they're going to be pass heavy in this one. There figures to be no ETN this week. So I'm thinking they're going to go pass heavy against a poor New England secondary who just got torched last week by Tank Dell, Schultz, and Diggs. And I expect Brian Thomas to also have a big game alongside this, along with Kirk. But I think Lawrence figures have a great game in this one.
I like Baker Mayfield this week. Believe it or not, he is second overall in fantasy quarterback scoring. I believe he leads all of football in passing touchdowns as well. Just been tremendous this year. I think he's a must start really no matter the matchup, but I love the matchup this week against Baltimore. This is one of the games I was talking about there a few minutes ago when I said some good matchups. This Bucs-Ravens game should be a good one. Baltimore's 31st against the pass, though. 275.7 passing yards per game, allow the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think Mayfield's going to be a great play in this matchup. Keep it going. He's had 3 games with 30-plus fantasy points. Might do it again in this matchup. All right, Henry, let's talk about the running back spot. Who's your favorite running back hot play for this week?
I have J.K. Dobbins against Arizona. Arizona's been very poor against the run this year, and Dobbins had a great game last week against Denver and looks to be the lead back, and no competition like whatsoever besides the Vidal 40-yard receiving touchdown. Not that many other people got carries with Gus Edwards being out besides Dobbins. He looked to be the lead workhorse. He gets a great matchup now this week against Arizona where it looks like they're going to be run heavy, and I think Dobbins should have another great game in this one.
I agree. I think Dobbins will do well. You're right. Nobody else really got carries besides Dobbins. Good news for him in a run-heavy offense. I like Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. Really been emerging. He has touchdowns 3 straight games. Last week was the first time all season he out-snapped Zach Moss. He was on the field more than Zach Moss. I think that bodes well for him going forward. He has double-digit carries 3 straight games, top 14 fantasy points all 3 of those games as well. I think he'll do it again this week against the Browns, another team that's in a tailspin. They're 21st against the run compared to 11th against the pass. I look for Brown to have another good showing and maybe find the end zone for a 4th straight week. All right, Henry, receiver hot play for this week.
I have Jordan Addison against Detroit. This game, I'm just going to say right now, it should be very high scoring. 2 high-powered offenses and 2 defenses where Minnesota's looked the part of being good, but Detroit's been very poor. But I think with Minnesota's defense, yes, it looks good. But Detroit just put up 50 points on Dallas last weekend in a pretty impressive game. So it looks to be a very high-scoring game. Detroit's secondary, very poor. I think Addison can have another great game in this one. He did against Green Bay. I know he didn't look the best 2 weeks ago against New York, but I think Addison's a great rebound game this week against Detroit.
I like Deontay Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. As long as Andy Dalton's starting, I think Johnson's a great play. Scored his 3rd touchdown of the season last week. He has scored his 3 or 4 games. He just looks like a different player with Andy Dalton throwing him passes. He has double-digit targets 3 of those 4 games as well, so he's getting a ton of looks. Plays Washington. They're going to have to play from behind. Washington's going to put up the points, and Washington's not very good defensively as well, so I think that is good news for Deontay Johnson. Washington allows the most fantasy points to receivers. Zay Flowers just torched that secondary last week. I think Johnson has another one of those big games in Week 7. All right, last hot play of the week, Henry. We're going to look at the tight end position. Who's your play here?
I have David Njoku. He had a solid week last week against the Eagles, and there's no Amari Cooper anymore in Cleveland. He has a good matchup this week against Cincinnati, whose defense has been very poor so far this year. I know we're all worried about Watson, but I think he's going to look at a big tight end in Njoku this week. So I think Njoku has a great game this week against Cincinnati.
Maybe he's the Evan Ingram of this week.
Yeah.
He's getting tons of targets. You never know. I think it could happen as well. My pick at tight end is Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. So we kind of thought last week was going to be his breakout game with Nico Collins out. He didn't exactly have a huge game. He caught 4 passes, but he had a season-high 8 targets. So I think that's a real positive for him. He still hasn't reached double-digit fantasy points in a game this year, but I think that's going to change this week against the Packers. Should be a high-scoring game. Again, another one of these games I'm really looking forward to. Houston, Green Bay. Packers are 25th against the pass, allow the third most fantasy points to tight ends. I like Schultz to get a good workout in this matchup. All right, Henry, let's talk about the opposite end of things. Some players we're fading for Week 7. Who's your first fade?
I have Kyler Murray versus the Chargers. It looks like Murray, he's had some up and down games so far this year. And this week, I'm going to assume no Marvin Harrison, looked like a pretty nasty concussion. And Kyler Murray didn't really look the part after he went out in that game against Green Bay. Now they get a tough Chargers defense where I'd be a little worried about Murray in this one, especially in the lead wide receiver. And they also go against the run, so I worry about Murray in this one.
I don't like Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers this week. Worries me a little bit. He's been getting a ton of volume, but he just hasn't done much. He has fewer than 65 rushing yards 3 or 4 games, hit the 100-yard mark just one time all season. His fantasy numbers have just been ho-hum despite getting a big workload. And I think if the Packers are going to have success in this matchup against Houston, it's going to be through the air. Houston's very good against the run. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to running backs. It's tough to bench Jacobs, but if you have better guys on your bench, better options, I'd consider doing it in Week 7. All right, Henry, give me another one of your fades for this week.
I have Brandon Ayuk versus the Chiefs. Chiefs been very good so far in the secondary, especially. Ayuk's had some very up and down games so far this year. We thought last week was going to be a huge game for him after he had 21 points the week before, and then he tailed off a little bit. I know Purdy didn't throw the ball as much. It kept it on the ground, but I worry about Ayuk in this one, especially with KC's secondary being so good, so I'd sit Ayuk this week.
I don't like Russell Wilson. I know he's moving to the starting lineup. Justin Fields is a top 10 fantasy quarterback right now, so some people might be thinking, hey, Wilson's going to start. He's going to be a Fields-type production player for fantasy teams. I don't like it. I'm not buying it, especially this week against the Jets. I think it's going to be a run-heavy game. New York really got torched on the ground last week by Ray Davis, and I think New York's going to struggle against the run again this week, so Najee Harris is going to get a lot of work. I just don't like Wilson in this matchup. Doesn't move as well on the ground. We've seen him not throwing the ball very well in recent seasons as well. First game of the season against a good pass defense. I'm worried about Wilson. I'm just staying away from him in this matchup. All right, Henry, who's your last fade for this week?
I have James Conner. I know it's another Arizona Cardinal, but he had a very poor game last week. Couldn't get really anything going against a good run defense. That was another tough matchup this week against the Chargers, who have a very good D-line. I looked to be a little banged up too a little bit, and it looked like Trey Benson got some more work, so he's going to eat into that workload, I think, as the season goes on, especially if Conner on an expiring contract. And I think this week I don't look towards Conner a lot this week, especially with that tough matchup, so I'd fade Conner this week.
All right, you're out on the Cardinals, obviously.
Yeah.
This week. All down on it. No Michael Wilson either.
No,
right.
Michael Wilson.
All right. So I actually have him on my cold list this week, ironically. So I'm not big on Darnell Mooney this week. I think he's really becoming a boom or bust fantasy play. He has 3 games with 14-plus fantasy points, 3 others with fewer than double-digit fantasy points. Been boom or bust. Had 3 catches for 38 yards in a favorable matchup last week, so that's concerning as well. I don't like him against Seattle, who's been pretty stingy against the pass this year. They allow the 11th fewest fantasy points to receivers. I would just leave Mooney on my bench in this one. All right, let's talk about a couple sleepers, some players maybe flying under the radar for this week, Henry. Who's your first sleeper for the week?
I have a guy who made his debut last week, and that's Drake May. He is Jacksonville, who's been very poor defensively, especially against quarterbacks. Caleb Williams just had, 4 touchdowns and almost 300 yards against him, and now Drake May in his second start's going over to London to play against him, where he had 3 touchdowns. I know he had 2 picks. One of them wasn't really his fault. But 3 touchdowns and almost 300 yards and about 40 rushing yards. I mean, there's some decent upside there in Drake May, especially with the running game. He might be able to run a little bit, but with a great matchup, I think Drake May is poised for a good game in this one.
Ramondre Stevenson's not looking good to play again with a foot injury, too. So I'm going to stick with that team, Henry, and I'm going to say Demario Douglas is my first sleeper. Really like him. He was one of my favorite waiver wire pickups this week. Career best 92 yards last week on 6 receptions. He has 9 targets each of his last 2 games, 6 or more receptions 3 or 4 games. As you mentioned, Jacksonville's a mess. Defensively, especially against the pass, dead last against the pass. Also allow the 2nd most fantasy points to receivers. I think Douglas is going to be a good play and could be a good play going forward with Drake May as his starting quarterback. All right, Henry, who's your last sleeper for the week?
I have a guy that came out of literally nowhere last week, and that is Bub Means of the New Orleans Saints. They played Denver this week, who just ruled out Patrick Surtain, so that's their top corner, out. And there's no Shaheed, Olave, or Taysom Hill for the Saints. So Bub Means played the most snaps out of the receivers last week after they went down, had the most targets. I think he's looked to be Rattler's option in that game a lot, and if Rattler's going again. So I think Bub Means is poised for a really good solid play this week if you need to start a receiver.
I like that, especially in DFS. Could be really cheap to get him. Definitely worth a shot. I like that. My last sleeper is a rookie, and it's Ladd McConkey, receiver with the Los Angeles Chargers. He's been just okay his rookie season, but he has double-digit fantasy points 2 of 5 games, so he's shown some potential, at least 4 receptions, 3 of 5 games. But it was encouraging to me to see Los Angeles air it out more last week. Through a season-high 34 passes, maybe they're going to be a little more diversified offensively, which would be good for McConkey because he plays the most. Played a team-high 63% of the snaps last week. I think he'll do well this week against Arizona. They allow the 8th most fantasy points to receivers, 22nd overall against the pass. So McConkey could be a good number 3 receiver, or much like your player Bub Means, maybe a good cheap DFS play for week 7. All right, Henry, that's our preview for week 7. Appreciate you coming on as always. Always a lot of fun talking with you.
Yeah, no problem. It's always a great time having with you.
All right, good luck to everybody out there in week 7. Hope you have a lot of success and you win all of your games this week. And also don't forget another early game. Jacksonville is still in London. They're playing
New England
against New England. We mentioned that a few times. So if you want to use any of those players, get those lineups set early. Again, good luck in all your games week 7. I hope you have a lot of success. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.